So, on the morning of April 4th, 2026, 3 black SUVs pulled through the Norwich entrance of Sandringham at 9:15 and delivered a set of legal documents that stripped Queen Camilla of access to an entire wing of the royal estate before she had finished her morning coffee at Clarence House. And the way it happened is what you need to understand before anything else, because this was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming match. There was no passive-aggressive seating arrangement at a state dinner. There was no tearful phone call that got out of hand. There was a document, quietly prepared, precisely timed, served at a gate by senior legal counsel who had driven 3 hours from London before most of the household staff had clocked in for the day. And the building itself, the estate's own biometric security system, did the rest. That is not how a family argument works. That is how a trap closes. By noon the following day, every access credential belonging to Camilla's architectural team had been centrally revoked. Contractors who arrived at the West Wing that afternoon found their security scans rejected. They were standing on royal ground. They simply could not enter the building. Nobody shouted at them. Nobody escorted them away. The system just said no, quietly and completely. And that was the end of it. A renovation project worth several £1 million, months of planning, signed contracts, scheduled work orders, stopped at a locked door without a single word being exchanged between the 2 women at the center of this. That is not an accident. That is architecture. The instrument at the heart of this is something called the Crown Private Estates Heritage Failsafe, a clause embedded in the Sandringham Estate's own governing deeds that automatically suspends any administrative order to alter the physical structure, interior design, or primary purpose of a designated heritage space if that order is issued without unanimous trustee consent. Camilla's renovation order for the West Wing triggered that clause the moment it was formally submitted. She did not need to be confronted. She did not need to be warned. The legal mechanism activated on its own, because it was built specifically for this situation to prevent a new reign from overwriting the physical memory of the one that came before it. And the executive who holds the binding authority to enforce that clause on behalf of the late Queen's estate is not the king. It is his sister. Princess Anne did not act here as a disgruntled family member. She did not file a complaint or write a strongly worded private letter or request an urgent meeting with the king's private secretary. She acted in her formal capacity as an executive trustee of the Sandringham private estate, a position personally conferred upon her by Queen Elizabeth II and documented in the estate's confidential governance structure in a way that carries enforceable legal weight entirely independent of the royal hierarchy. When Anne signed the injunction notice, she was not speaking as a princess. In the eyes of British property law, she was speaking with the binding legal voice of a dead queen. That distinction is the entire story, and it gets darker from there. Because at the center of this dispute is not just a wing of a country house. It is a specific room, room 102, known within the family as the Blue Sitting Room, the space where Queen Elizabeth II spent her final quiet days at Sandringham, approving her last state documents, conducting her last private correspondence. For Anne, that room is not a conference suite waiting to be modernized. It is a cathedral, and the idea of it being converted into the administrative headquarters of Camilla's Royal Foundation modernization project was, according to people close to Anne's legal team, the specific detail that moved this from a concern to a crisis. One witness close to the confrontation at the estate gates on April 4th reported a brief exchange between a senior estate manager and Anne's lead attorney. The manager asked under whose authority entry was being barred to the Queen's designated staff. The attorney's response was immediate. Under the authority of the Crown Private Estates Heritage Clause and the confidential mandates of the late Queen's final estate documentation, there was no further discussion. The gate remained closed. And here is the detail that matters most. The one that tells you everything about the nature of what Anne has done. By moving this dispute from a private conversation to a formal legal filing, she has removed the king's ability to simply order her to stand down. If Charles wants to reverse this injunction, he cannot do it with a phone call or a quiet instruction to his private secretary. He would have to formally challenge the legal structures that govern his own private property structures that also protect his own estate rights as a private individual. His advisors have reportedly told him in explicit terms that attempting to override the filing would create a legal precedent catastrophic enough to threaten the financial architecture of the monarchy's private wealth. This wasn't a family argument that found a lawyer. This was a pre-positioned legal mechanism, built on the documented wishes of a dead queen, deployed at the exact moment of maximum strategic effect by the one person who had been quietly preparing it for nearly 3 years. The gate at Sandringham is still closed. The biometric credentials are still revoked. The deadline is April 21st, the centenary of Queen Elizabeth's birth. And the question that nobody inside Buckingham Palace can currently answer is not whether Anne has the legal authority to hold this position. She does. The question is what else she is prepared to reveal before that deadline arrives. Before we go any further, subscribe to Royal Signal so you don't miss what comes next. There's a lot more to this story, and it's still unfolding. The whole thing actually starts with a staff meeting at Balmoral on September 8, 2024, and almost nobody paid attention at the time. It was the second anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death. A solemn occasion. A private one. The kind of gathering where the family was supposed to sit quietly inside their grief and honor the weight of what they had lost. And in the middle of it, according to people present in that room, Queen Camilla raised a proposal. A sweeping administrative overhaul of the Sandringham estate staffing structure. Specifically, the replacement of the late Queen's long-standing household loyalists with a new administrative team drawn from Camilla's own office. The proposal was framed as modernization, as necessary evolution, as the kind of sensible institutional housekeeping that a confident new reign requires to move forward, without being anchored to the past. The room went quiet. Princess Anne, seated near the window, said nothing. She listened. She did not object. She did not question. She simply absorbed every word, with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what they are going to do, and has no interest in announcing it in advance. And within 48 hours, according to estate trustees who later documented the precise sequence of events, Anne had already contacted the senior trustees to request a quiet, exhaustive review of the Sandringham estate's confidential trust files. Not loudly, not visibly, without a single communication that could be traced back to a reaction. She was auditing the future while everyone else in that room was still grieving the past. That meeting is the overlooked origin of everything that followed. Not the renovation order, not the jewelry reclassification, not the legal notice served at the Norwich gate. That meeting, that proposal, that silence from a woman who never says nothing without meaning something. The public version of the 18 months that followed told a coherent and reassuring story. Palace communications were consistent. The transition from Queen Elizabeth's era to King Charles's reign was handled with grace. Camilla was photographed at Sandringham for the Christmas walkabout, warmly received, visibly settled into her role. The West Wing renovation plans were described internally as a natural and forward-looking modernization, the sign of a new reign confident enough to reshape its own spaces without being paralyzed by reverence for the old ones. Press briefings emphasized continuity. Spokespersons used words like evolution and vision. The world was invited to believe that the two most powerful women in the royal household had found their equilibrium, that the difficult, friction-filled years of adjustment were behind them, that the institution was, finally, stable. But according to what is now coming out, during that exact same period, while the public was watching Christmas walkabouts and reading carefully managed statements about royal modernization, a completely different operation was running in parallel. Anne's legal team was conducting a shadow audit of the Sandringham estate. Every artifact, every trust document, every access protocol, every administrative decision that had touched the estate's protected collection since the transition of the reign. Sources close to the trustee council described the process as methodical, surgical, and entirely invisible to the palace communications office. No leaks, no signals, no moments where the public version and the private operation accidentally made contact. The gap between what the world was being shown and what Anne was actually doing, that gap is the engine of everything that followed, and the person who benefited most from that gap remaining invisible, for as long as possible, was Camilla. Every month the audit stayed hidden was another month her administrative expansion could advance without challenge, without scrutiny, without anyone in a position of legal authority asking the questions that Anne was quietly compiling into a case. Someone inside the Sandringham estate's administrative structure made a decision, an active, deliberate decision not to flag the anomalies being discovered during Anne's review to the king's senior advisors. This was not a clerical oversight. It was not a filing delay. The specific reclassification of the Vladimir tiara and two other pieces from the permanent sovereign collection to long-term personal loan status designated for the office of the Queen Consort was processed through the estate's digital records system in a manner that bypassed the standard trustee notification protocol. That protocol exists for a precise reason. It ensures that when the legal status of a protected item changes, the governing trustees are automatically alerted so they can assess whether the change is authorized. Bypassing it is not a technical error. It requires a conscious administrative choice at a level with access to the system's override functions. Someone made that choice. The record changed. The alarm did not sound, and the public and Anne were left to go on believing that the collection was exactly as it had always been, undisturbed and intact, in the rooms where the late Queen had left it. Because if you are Princess Anne and you have just discovered not through a communication, not through a trustee notification, but through your own independent audit, that 3 pieces of jewelry from your mother's permanent sovereign collection have been quietly reclassified in a digital ledger, processed through an administrative bypass that was specifically designed to avoid triggering the oversight mechanism that you are legally empowered to enforce, then you are not thinking about a renovation dispute. You are not thinking about contractors or architectural plans or the modernization of a country house. You are thinking about how long this has been happening. You are thinking about what else has already been moved. You are thinking about whether the thing you believed you were protecting was already partially gone before you even knew to look. And you are thinking about one more thing. The thing that turns a legal concern into something closer to a mission. You are thinking about who made the decision to hide it, and whether they understood, when they made that decision, exactly who they were hiding it from. The confrontation that changed everything did not happen at Sandringham. It did not happen in a throne room or a formal meeting chamber or any of the grand institutional spaces where the monarchy conducts its official business. It happened in the drawing room on the upper corridor of Clarence House on December 15th, 2025, a room with heavy curtains and a writing desk near the window and a connecting door to the adjoining anteroom that was, on that particular afternoon, standing exactly 2 inches open. The estate secretary who stepped into that anteroom to retrieve a briefing file did not announce herself. She had no reason to. The door was supposed to be latched. It was not. She reached for the file, registered the voices on the other side of the gap, and then went completely still. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood in that anteroom for the duration of what followed, and later described hearing every word with a clarity that she had not sought and could not forget. That 2-inch gap is the physical accident at the center of this story. Everything that is now unfolding in legal filings and injunctions and revoked biometric credentials traces back, in part, to a door that someone forgot to close all the way on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Camilla was not told by Anne directly. That is the first thing to understand about how the confrontation began. She was told by her own chief of staff, who had received a formal written communication from the estate trustees the previous evening, outlining Anne's concerns regarding the administrative changes being made to the estate's protected collection. The chief of staff came to Camilla that morning and delivered the summary in that careful, cold tone that people use when they know their words are about to detonate reading from a printed page. Voice professionally flat, eyes not quite making contact, the way people hold themselves when they need to ensure that whatever happens next cannot be attributed to the messenger. Camilla's physical reaction, according to the secretary who was standing in the anteroom with her hand still resting on the briefing file, was a silence that lasted longer than expected. And then she set down the piece of correspondence she had been holding, deliberately, precisely, on the table beside her, without looking at where she was placing it. The way people set things down when they need their hands to be empty, before they decide what to do next. What followed was not loud. That is the detail that everyone who has heard any version of this account remarks upon first. It was not a shouting match. It was not tearful. It was conducted at a temperature that was somehow colder than anger, the particular register that highly controlled people operate in when they are furious and have decided that fury is a luxury they cannot currently afford. Camilla's position, as she articulated it in that room, was coherent and in its own way entirely understandable. She had been performing the public function of Queen Consort for 3 years. She had attended every engagement, absorbed every institutional demand, endured every headline, and managed every public appearance, with a discipline that the role required and that she had never once publicly complained about. She had earned, she believed, the right to shape the working environment in which she operated. The West Wing of Sandringham was not a museum. It was a functional part of a working royal household. And the suggestion that a trust document, a legal mechanism designed for a previous era, could physically prevent her from entering a room in her own husband's primary private estate felt, to her, like a procedural humiliation dressed up as constitutional principle. She wanted it resolved, quietly, internally, without the machinery of formal legal proceedings making a private disagreement into a public crisis. That was the appeal she was making, to reason, to proportion, to the understanding that institutions are run by people, and people can choose to be practical when the alternative serves no one. Anne's response, according to the secretary in the anteroom, arrived without hesitation and without warmth. She said, "The estate does not recognize domestic proximity as a legal basis for access rights. It recognizes trustees. 15 words. No raised voice. No visible anger. Just 15 words delivered with the precision of someone who had been carrying that sentence for a long time and had finally found the exact moment it needed to be said. That is the line that undid everything Camilla believed she had secured. Because what those 15 words did quietly, completely, without any of the drama that a more emotional confrontation might have allowed, Camilla to push back against was remove the entire emotional and relational architecture of her argument. The decades of endurance, the public role faithfully performed, the marriage, the proximity to the king, the assumption that love and legitimate belonging and years of quiet sacrifice had conferred upon her a permanent and unconditional place inside the private structure of this family. Anne had just told her, without raising her voice above a conversational register, that none of that existed in the legal framework she was standing inside. Camilla had believed, for years, that being queen meant she was owed a certain inheritance of access, that the crown, once extended, became hers by right of occupation. Anne had just told her that she had never actually held it. She had only ever been permitted to stand near it, and the permission had conditions she had not been shown. Anne did not call after her when Camilla left the room. She stayed exactly where she was standing at the window, both hands resting on the ledge, looking out across the courtyard below. A member of staff who entered briefly some minutes later described her as completely still, not triumphant, not visibly distressed, staring at the iron gates of the courtyard with an expression that the staff member later struggled to name. She did not speak for several minutes after the door closed. The silence in the room was, by every account, absolute. He did not move toward the door. He did not reach for a telephone. He simply stayed where he was, looking at the gates, at the gravel, at the familiar geometry of a space he had known his entire life, and said nothing. What Camilla carried out of that room was not a new wound. That is the essential thing to understand. The specific injury, the feeling of having been present, patient, and enduring for decades, and then being told quietly and institutionally, that presence is not the same as belonging. That wound did not originate in a Clarence House drawing room in December 2025. It was opened there again. It goes back much further, to the years of being acknowledged privately and denied publicly, to the long, careful wait for a legitimacy that was always conditional, always qualified, always extended with a small, invisible asterisk attached. That room did not create the wound. It found it, precisely, without apology. What Anne carried out was a different weight entirely. The particular burden of someone who has just done the thing that needed to be done and understands, with complete clarity, that necessary actions of this kind cannot be walked back. She had chosen the legal framework over the family peace. She had chosen the document over the relationship. And she had done it knowing exactly what it would cost, not just to Camilla, but to the broader fragile architecture of a family that had never been as unified as its public appearances suggested. What Camilla would do with that reopened wound was the question that nobody in that building could answer. Because a woman who has waited this long, built this carefully, endured this much, and now found herself told coldly, legally, finally, that the belonging she believed she had earned was never unconditionally hers, is not finished. She is not retreating. She is standing very still in a corridor somewhere, thinking about what she still has access to, and what she might do with it before the next door closes. To understand what Princess Anne is actually protecting, what she is willing to trigger a constitutional crisis to defend, what she considers worth, the legal fees, and the family fracture, and the cold silence that has now settled over two royal households, you need to understand what Sandringham has already survived, because this estate is not simply old. It is scarred in ways that most people who photograph it from the public road have never been told about. It has been fought over, nearly sold, administratively stripped, and legally reclaimed across more than a century of British history. And the rooms at the center of this current dispute do not merely contain history, they are built from it. Every wall carries the weight of a decision that someone, at some point, was willing to destroy something precious to reverse. What Anne is holding is not a country house. It is the accumulated result of every occasion and to understand why she will not move, why no private conversation, no royal instruction, no appeal to family unity has shifted her position by a single degree, you need to understand what this estate has already come back from. The first thing Sandringham survived was its own near disappearance. In the months following the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII surrendered the throne in circumstances that humiliated the institution and destabilized the family's public standing at its most fragile moment, there were serious and documented discussions at the highest levels of the royal household about whether the private estates should be liquidated. Sandringham was specifically named. The financial burden of a reign that had ended in disgrace, combined with the uncertainty surrounding the incoming king's ability to stabilize the monarchy's public finances, made the sale of several private properties appear not just logical, but necessary. Valuations were commissioned. Senior household advisors prepared formal assessments. The paperwork existed. The conversation was real. Several people in positions of genuine authority believed the sale was not a possibility but an inevitability. What stopped it was not sentiment. It was not an emotional appeal from a grieving family. It was a single written intervention by the incoming King George VI, a man who had never wanted the throne and had accepted it under circumstances. No one would have chosen who insisted formally and on the record that Sandringham was not a disposable asset. It was a constitutional anchor. Its loss would not merely be a financial transaction. It would be a signal to the institution, to the public, to history, that the monarchy could be reduced by crisis. That under sufficient pressure, the things it held most privately could be surrendered. The estate came back from the edge of erasure, not because anyone particularly romanticized it, but because one person understood that what you choose to protect in a moment of institutional weakness defines what the institution actually is. Sandringham survived its first existential threat before the Second World War had even begun. The building that Camilla's contractors could not enter on April 5, 2026 is the same building that almost ceased to belong to the crown 89 years earlier. Anne knows this history. She was raised inside it. What is happening right now has happened before. Almost exactly. With different names and different paperwork and a different reigning monarch, but the same essential architecture of overreach and response. In the months following the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, a quiet administrative battle was fought inside the royal household over the management of the private collections at Sandringham. The central figure was a senior household administrator appointed by the new reign, a person of genuine ability and institutional ambition who had been brought in specifically to modernize the estate's operational structure, who believed, with some justification, that the administrative frameworks inherited from the previous reign were inefficient and due for revision. The administrator began reclassifying items in the estate's collection. The changes were processed through the record system in ways that bypassed the existing trustee oversight structure. The reclassifications were not individually dramatic. Each one, examined alone, appeared to be routine administrative housekeeping, the kind of quiet reordering that large institutional collections require periodically to remain manageable. But examined together, across several months, a pattern became visible that alarmed the estate's senior trustees. Items were moving. Designations were changing. The collection that had existed under one sovereign was being quietly reorganized under the administrative logic of another, and the people legally empowered to oversee that collection had not been consulted, notified, or informed. The disagreement reached the desk of the Queen's private secretary before the end of that year. It was resolved in favor of the trustees, completely and without compromise. The administrator was reassigned to a different function. Every reclassified item was restored to its original designation. The trustee notification protocol was formally reinforced in the estate's governing documents. No public announcement was ever made. No press release acknowledged the dispute. The resolution appeared in the internal estate records as a routine administrative correction, filed quietly, noticed by almost no one outside the household. That was 73 years ago. The administrator believed they were modernizing an institution. The trustees believed they were protecting a sovereign's legacy. The legal framework sided with the trustees. The pattern did not begin with Camilla's renovation order. It did not begin with the jewelry reclassification of 2026. It began the moment a new reign assumed that administrative authority over a private estate was a natural extension of institutional power and discovered, through the resistance of a legal structure older than anyone currently living, that it was not. The pattern is not new. Only the names have changed. And after all of that, after the near sale of 1936, after the administrative battle of 53, after 7 decades of legal structures carefully reinforced, specifically to prevent a successor reign from quietly rewriting the record of the one that came before it, the question of what happens to room 102 at Sandringham is being decided by a renovation contract issued in the winter of 2025. a document signed by people who understood the square footage of the West Wing and the budget requirements of a modernization project and the communications value of a new royal headquarters. People who may not have known or may have chosen not to ask about the heritage failsafe clause embedded in the estate's own governing deeds, about the trustee notification protocol that their administrative bypass had circumvented, about the executive whose legal authority over this estate derives not from her current title but from the written and documented will of the woman whose private journals are now missing from a secured vault. Ask yourself whether everyone who signed those contracts fully understood what they were holding. And ask yourself whether the answer to that question makes what followed better or worse. And this legal blockade did not come from nowhere. It did not arrive fully formed on the morning of April 4th as a sudden impulse or an emotional reaction to a renovation order that went too far. It had been building for years, in small, documented, systematically ignored increments that seemed entirely manageable at the time, that were treated as minor friction rather than early warning, that were absorbed and filed and noted by a woman who never confused patience with acceptance. What happened at the Norwich Gate on April 4th was not a beginning. It was a conclusion, the visible end of a process that had been running quietly, invisibly, and with complete deliberateness for nearly 3 years before a single legal document was ever served. To understand why Anne moved when she did, and why she moved the way she did, you need to go back to where the record actually starts. The first incident happened in the spring of 2023. The new reign was barely 6 months old. The household was still finding its operational rhythm, still negotiating the hundreds of small institutional adjustments that the transition of a sovereign requires. In that context, in the general atmosphere of reorganization and fresh administrative energy that surrounds any new reign, Princess Anne submitted a formal procedural request to the estate trustees. It was not a dramatic demand. It carried no ultimatum. It asked for nothing more than a single additional step in the existing administrative process, specifically that the trustees be formally consulted and notified before any changes were finalized regarding the permanent display arrangements in the private apartments at Sandringham. This was, by any reasonable measure, a minor request. It asked for notification, not veto power. It asked for inclusion in a process, not control over its outcome. It was submitted through the correct channels, in the correct format, with the correct level of institutional courtesy. It was acknowledged by the relevant administrative office. A response was issued confirming receipt, and then nothing happened. The consultation step was not implemented. The notification protocol was not added to the process. The decisions regarding the apartment display arrangements went ahead on the existing timeline, without trustee consultation, without the additional step Anne had formally requested, and without any explanation of why the request had not been accommodated. No one apologized. No one explained. No one followed up with a quiet conversation acknowledging that the request had been received and considered and declined for specific reasons that could be openly discussed. It simply did not happen, and Anne said nothing publicly. She returned to her schedule. She attended her engagements. She performed every function her role required with the same visible discipline she had maintained for decades. But she noted the outcome, carefully, in writing, in a private record that, at that point, contained its first entry. The second incident arrived in the autumn of 2024, the same season as the Balmoral staff meeting, the same season as the shadow audit that was already running without the palace's knowledge. This time, the stakes were considerably higher, and the method of discovery was considerably more humiliating. A significant piece from the Sandringham estate's private collection, one that Anne had specifically referenced in her 2023 procedural request as an item requiring trustee oversight before any change in its designation or display status, appeared in a photographed inventory released through the Palace Communications Office as part of a broader media engagement exercise. The photograph was published. The public saw it. Royal correspondents noted it. And in the photograph, the item had moved. Its designation had changed. Its status in the collection had been altered in a way that directly contradicted the procedural protection Anne had formally requested be applied to it 18 months earlier. Anne did not find out through a trustee notification. She did not receive a private communication from the estate's administrative office explaining that a change had been made and inviting her response. She found out the same way anyone else did, through a published photograph. Through a camera pointed at a room in a building she was legally empowered to oversee, showing her an alteration that had been made without her knowledge, without trustee consultation, and without the notification step she had formally requested nearly 2 years before. She said nothing publicly, not a word, not a comment to a correspondent. not a signal through any of the back channels that senior royals use when they want a message delivered without being seen to deliver it. She maintained the same composed, unreadable exterior that she had always maintained, but according to people who have worked closely with her for years, something shifted in that moment in a way that was permanent and irreversible. She stopped trusting verbal assurances. She stopped believing that institutional goodwill, if extended generously enough and patiently enough, would eventually produce the right outcome on its own, and she began keeping records in a manner that was qualitatively different from anything she had done before. Not notes, not informal observations. A structured, referenced, dated archive of every instance where the procedural protections she was legally empowered to enforce had been bypassed, ignored, or quietly circumvented. An archive built not for her own memory but for eventual use. The distinction between those two things is the difference between a diary and a legal dossier. The third incident is the one you already know, because it is the one that is currently freezing the west wing of Sandringham and costing the king's personal funds the equivalent of several £100,000 in constitutional legal fees. But understanding it as the third incident, rather than the first, changes everything about what it means. The Vladimir Tiara reclassification in February 2026 was not a shock to Anne. It was a confirmation. The renovation order issued in March 2026 was not a surprise. It was the third data point in a pattern she had been documenting since 2023, the moment when the pattern became undeniable enough, and the stakes became significant enough, and the legal mechanism available to her became precisely applicable enough that waiting any longer would not be patience. It would be complicity. She did not file the injunction in anger. She filed it when the record was complete, when the case was irrefutable, when the act being challenged was so unambiguous in its violation of the estate's governing protections that no one, not the king's advisors, not the palace communications office, not the most sympathetic possible reading of Camilla's administrative intentions could characterize what Anne did in response as an overreach. She had waited for the moment when she could not be accused of reacting, and then she acted. According to people who have worked closely with Princess Anne for years, the private archive she maintained across this period is described in terms that make it sound less like a personal record and more like a prepared legal exhibit. Methodical, cross-referenced, organized by date, by administrative action, by the specific trustee notification protocol that each action had bypassed, and by the name or office responsible for processing each decision. It contains, by all accounts, documentation of every occasion across nearly 3 years where the procedural protections surrounding the estate's collection and private apartments were circumvented, along with the communications Anne sent in response to each occasion, and the responses she received and the responses she did not receive. It is the archive of someone who understood, from very early on, that the conflict she was watching develop would eventually require evidence rather than testimony, and who began collecting that evidence before anyone else in the building understood that a conflict was developing at all. That kind of patient, buried, systematically constructed documentation tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud. Outrage announces itself. It gives the target time to prepare a response, to manage a narrative, to position themselves as the reasonable party in an unreasonable situation. Patient documentation does none of those things. It simply accumulates, invisibly, until the moment it is deployed, and by then, it is too late to dispute the record, because the record is the record. It contains dates. It contains names. It contains the specific communications that were sent and the specific responses that were not received. It cannot be characterized as emotional or reactive because it was built over years, not hours. It cannot be dismissed as an overreach because every entry in it corresponds to a specific legal protection that was specifically violated. The person who acts on that kind of archive has not been waiting for an excuse. They have been waiting for the moment when the archive is complete enough to be used, when the pattern is documented thoroughly enough that the response to it cannot be dismissed as disproportionate, when the case is not just strong but irrefutable. That moment arrived in February 2026. Anne waited 6 more weeks anyway. She waited until the renovation order was issued, until the act was so clearly and unambiguously a violation of the estate's own governing protections that the legal mechanism activated on its own the moment the order was submitted. She waited until she could not be accused of looking for a reason to act, because she had not been looking for a reason. She had been building a record, and the record had found its own reason, exactly on schedule, exactly as she had known it eventually would. Some of you are probably wondering whether Princess Anne can actually do this, whether a princess, however senior, however long-serving, however deeply embedded in the institutional fabric of the British monarchy, can legally lock a reigning queen consort out of a royal estate without the explicit permission of the sitting king. Whether the injunction currently freezing the west wing of Sandringham is a genuine exercise of enforceable legal authority, or whether it is, at its core, an aggressive family member making an aggressive legal argument that will eventually be quietly dismantled once the palace finds the right moment to make it disappear. Whether any of this is structurally valid, whether it holds, the answer is yes, it holds. Anne can do exactly what she has done, and the reason why is more interesting and more consequential than the dispute itself, because it reveals something about the architecture of royal power that most people who follow this family have never been shown. The specific legal mechanism operating here runs on two simultaneous tracks, and both of them need to be understood separately before they can be understood together. The first track is Anne's formal position as an executive trustee of the Sandringham private estate. This is not an honorary designation. It is not a ceremonial title bestowed as a gesture of family affection or seniority. It is a documented legal appointment, personally conferred by Queen Elizabeth II and recorded in the estate's confidential governance structure that carries enforceable authority over decisions affecting the trust's protected assets under British property law. When Anne acts in this capacity, when she signs a legal document, files an injunction, or formally invokes the estate's governing protections, she is not acting as a member of the royal family, expressing a personal preference. She is acting as the legal representative of the trust itself. In the eyes of British property law, her signature on the injunction notice does not carry the weight of a princess's opinion. It carries the binding legal voice of the trust's executive authority. And that authority derives not from her current position in the royal hierarchy, but from a documented mandate issued by the previous sovereign. The king did not grant it. The king cannot simply revoke it. The second track is the heritage failsafe clause, embedded in the Sandringham estate's own governing deeds, a legal mechanism so precisely constructed that it does not require human judgment to activate. Certain areas of the estate are designated as heritage spaces whose primary purpose, physical character, and interior configuration cannot be altered without the unanimous consent of the full trustee council. The clause does not distinguish between who issued the alteration order. It does not make an exception for the queen consort. It does not defer to the administrative authority of the sitting monarch's household. It simply states a condition unauthorized alteration order issued and a consequence emergency suspension of that order, and it executes that consequence automatically the moment the condition is met. Camilla's renovation order for the West Wing met that condition the moment it was formally submitted through the estate's administrative system. The failsafe activated. The legal suspension followed. Anne did not need to make a decision. The document made it for her. Legally, she needed no permission slip. No vote was taken. Nothing required the king's authorization. The deeds filed the injunction the moment the renovation order arrived. What made this so unusual was not whether Anne had the right. She did. What made it unprecedented was the speed and the combination of moves that accompanied the activation of that right. A combination that royal legal historians are struggling to find a parallel for in any previous reign. Decisions of this nature formally invoking a heritage failsafe, revoking biometric access credentials across an entire wing of a royal estate, filing a legal injunction against a sitting queen consort's administrative office, simultaneously requesting security logs from the Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit would normally unfold across months of internal negotiation. There would be private conversations first, then formal letters between legal representatives, then a period of mediated discussion. Then, if all of that failed, a cautious and carefully worded legal filing that gave all parties sufficient time and cover to manage the public narrative around it. The entire process, from first formal objection to active legal enforcement, would typically take the better part of a year. Longer, in cases involving the Queen Consort's office. Longer still, in cases where the sitting king's personal property interests were implicated. This happened in 72 hours. Between the issuance of the renovation order and the serving of the legal notice at the Norwich Gate, fewer than 72 hours elapsed. The speed alone is without modern precedent, but it is the combination, the simultaneous activation of multiple legal and institutional mechanisms, each one individually defensible, together, forming a pattern of coordinated enforcement that sealed every possible exit before anyone inside the palace had fully registered that the door had closed. That is making royal legal historians reach for historical comparisons they cannot quite find. Here is the detail that should unsettle anyone paying careful attention to how this was executed. When the estate's trustee structure was last formally invoked in any publicly visible way, in a considerably less dramatic context in 2012, Relating to a minor boundary clarification involving a portion of the estate's outer grounds, the palace issued a press statement. Brief, carefully worded, entirely routine in tone, but present. A public acknowledgement that a formal process had been engaged, that it was proceeding normally, that there was nothing unusual to see. The standard institutional transparency that signals to the press and the public that the machinery is working as designed and that the people operating it have nothing to conceal about the fact that they are operating it. This time, there was nothing. No statement, no spokesperson comment, no background briefing to trusted correspondents, no signal of any kind through any of the channels the palace normally uses to manage the narrative around institutional processes it wants the public to understand as routine. Just a quiet legal filing processed through the estate's administrative system. A digital access revocation executed through the security infrastructure. A notice served at a gate by counsel who arrived before the household had fully woken up and left before anyone thought to call a photographer. When a previous comparable administrative action came with a press release, and this one came with absolute silence, that silence is not neutral. Silence inside an institution that is constitutionally required to manage its public image at all times is never simply the absence of communication. It is a communication. It says, "We are not explaining this because an explanation would require us to describe what triggered it, and what triggered it is not something we are prepared to describe publicly. Not yet. Possibly not ever." That silence screams louder than any press release ever could. Consider what Anne's team accomplished across those 72 hours, stacked together in sequence. The heritage failsafe clause was triggered by the renovation order, and the legal suspension was automatically generated. The emergency injunction was drafted, reviewed, and physically served at the estate gates. The biometric access credentials of Camilla's entire architectural and administrative team were centrally revoked through the estate's security infrastructure. A formal request for the complete security logs from the Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit covering the northern corridor of Sandringham was filed and acknowledged, and a legal deadline of April 21st was embedded in the notice, a date chosen with the specific precision of someone who understood that the centenary of a sovereign's birth is the most legally and symbolically powerful moment available to invoke that sovereign's documented wishes. Examined individually, each of these moves looks like a single, defensible legal procedure. A trustee enforcing a heritage clause, a security system responding to a change in access authorization, a legal filing requesting documentation relevant to an ongoing investigation, routine institutional machinery operating exactly as designed. Examined together, in sequence, across 72 hours, they reveal something that was not assembled in 72 hours. They reveal a plan that was constructed across months, possibly across the full 3 years of the shadow audit, and then executed with a speed and coordination that left no gap between moves, no window for a countermove, no moment where the palace could intervene between one action and the next, before the next one had already landed. Royal historians who have studied the governance records of past reigns say they cannot find another example of this many major estate powers shifting this fast, this completely, and this silently without a single official announcement ever being issued to confirm what happened, explain why it happened, or indicate what is expected to happen next. The machinery worked exactly as it was designed to work. What nobody anticipated was that someone had been planning, for years, exactly when and how to use it. Inside the Sandringham household this week, the changes are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves with the kind of visible, photographable rupture that gives a story its clearest narrative shape. There is no single image that captures what has shifted. Instead, the changes are quieter than that, and quieter, in this context, means more serious. Because the people who live and work inside this institution understand that the loudest signals are almost never the most significant ones. It is the small withdrawals, the absent routines, the doors that remain closed at hours when they are normally open, that tell you what the large public gestures are being staged to conceal. The West Wing remains under legal quarantine. The renovation contractors have not returned. The biometric systems at the estate's access points continue to reject the credentials of everyone associated with Camilla's architectural and administrative team. That much is visible to anyone paying attention to the legal filings. But the more telling signals are subtler than the injunction itself, and they are accumulating in ways that people close to both households are finding increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidental. Camilla has canceled or quietly deprioritized several minor engagements this week, the kind of low-visibility public appearances that her office almost never abandons precisely because they are the connective tissue of a working royal schedule the unglamorous proof of presence that distinguishes an active queen consort from one who has retreated from the field. These are not state occasions or high-profile ceremonial duties. They are the smaller, regular appointments that fill the spaces between the photographed moments and that are, for exactly that reason, the hardest to miss without it meaning something. Sources describe the atmosphere inside Clarence House as having taken on a quality of unusual withdrawal. A building that has stopped generating its ordinary noise, where the regular rhythms of a working household have slowed in ways that staff find difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. Silence inside a family built entirely on carefully managed public appearances is rarely ever just silence. It is almost always a decision being made behind closed doors, a recalculation happening in private before the next public move is determined, and the specific quality of this silence, its timing, its breadth, the particular engagements it has swallowed is being read by everyone inside both households as exactly that. Not grief, not coincidence, a decision in progress. According to people familiar with private discussions currently happening inside the palace's legal advisory structure, the king's constitutional solicitors are examining whether a formal mediation framework can be established under the auspices of the Duchy of Lancaster's governing body. This mechanism, if successfully initiated, would bring both sides of the dispute into a confidential resolution process, overseen by a neutral institutional authority, one with sufficient legal standing, to produce an agreement that binds all parties without requiring a public court proceeding that would expose the full scope of the dispute to press and parliamentary scrutiny. The strategic logic of this approach, from the king's perspective, is straightforward. A duchy-mediated resolution would allow Charles to position himself as the architect of a sensible institutional solution, rather than a monarch forced to choose publicly between his wife and his sister. It would give Camilla's office a structured way to withdraw from the West Wing renovation, without the withdrawal reading as a defeat, and it would give Anne a formal acknowledgement of the trustee protections she has been enforcing, without requiring her to escalate the legal proceedings to a point where the missing dispatch box and everything its disappearance implies becomes the subject of a public police investigation. The problem, as those same sources describe it with considerable understatement, is that this framework requires voluntary participation from all parties. And as of this morning, Anne's legal team has communicated no willingness to pause the current proceedings in favor of a mediated alternative. The injunction remains active. The April 21st deadline remains fixed, and the duchy mechanism, which requires weeks of preliminary negotiation before it can even be formally initiated, is running out of time at a rate that the centenary calendar will not accommodate. The king is attempting to build a bridge across a gap that is closing faster than the bridge can be constructed. At least one senior legal figure with direct and documented knowledge of the Sandringham estate's trust structure has reportedly raised, in private and in terms that those who heard it described as deliberately measured rather than alarmist, a possibility that nobody in the palace is willing to discuss publicly, but that everyone in the relevant rooms is now thinking about with considerable urgency. If the Wickwarren dispatch box containing Queen Elizabeth's private manuscripts, personal journals, and final unedited correspondence cannot be located and formally returned to its designated secured vault before the April 21st deadline, Princess Anne's legal team has the standing, the documented evidence trail, and the institutional mandate to request a formal Metropolitan Police investigation into the disappearance of trust-protected property from a secured royal residence. This would not be a civil proceeding. It would not be a family dispute processed through private legal channels. It would be a criminal investigation, conducted by police, involving the Queen Consort's administrative office, during the week of a nationally televised centenary commemoration. Nothing this binding, this institutionally catastrophic, this without precedent in the modern history of the British monarchy, has ever been formally initiated against a sitting Queen Consort. There is no template for it. There is no established protocol for managing its consequences. There is no historical playbook that the Palace Communications Office can reach for to contain the narrative once it begins, which means everything Anne has survived to reach this point, the audit, the confrontation at Clarence House, the injunction, the biometric lockout, the security log request might not be the conclusion of this war at all. It might only be the evidence-gathering phase that precedes the opening argument. The centenary of Queen Elizabeth II's birth on April 21st is now functioning as something that nobody planned for it to be, an unavoidable exposure event. A fixed point on the public calendar that was supposed to represent national unity and institutional continuity and the dignified honoring of a reign that defined an era, and that is instead approaching like a deadline in a legal thriller, with everyone inside the palace privately aware that what happens before it arrives will determine what the occasion itself looks like, and who is present for it, and what it means. Palace staff have quietly begun using language in internal communications that sources describe as normally reserved for occasions of historic institutional finality. Careful, formal phrasing that experienced household members associate not with celebratory preparation, but with the management of significant transitions. Extra security sweeps have been commissioned for the private apartments at Sandringham in the days preceding the commemoration. A senior archivist has been brought in on a temporary engagement that no one in the household has explained publicly, and that no one has denied. The guest protocol for the private family gathering that precedes the public ceremony has been formally revised twice in the past 7 days. Twice, for a gathering that was described, when it was first announced, as intimate and straightforward and entirely routine in its composition. Ask yourself why a guest list for a private family commemoration requires 2 formal revisions in the space of a single week. Ask yourself what kind of uncertainty about the composition of a gathering would make its organizers revise it not once but twice in the middle of an active legal dispute, with a fixed public deadline approaching. Ask yourself why extra security sweeps would be commissioned for private apartments at an estate whose west wing is currently under a legal injunction that nobody in the palace has publicly acknowledged. And when you have asked yourself all of those questions, you will understand why so many people who are close to this family and who have been watching this situation develop, with the particular attention of those who know where to look, believe they already know exactly what is coming on April 21st. And why they believe, with a quiet certainty that none of them are willing to state on the record, that what is coming will not look anything like the unity the palace has been publicly promising. Not even close. There is an image that keeps returning to those who have been closest to this situation throughout the past week. It was described by a source present at the outer perimeter of Sandringham on the afternoon of April 5th. The afternoon, the biometric lockout took full effect, and the west wing went completely dark behind its closed gates. Camilla was driven past the estate that afternoon. The car did not stop. It slowed, briefly, near the Norwich entrance, the same entrance where the legal notice had been served that morning, and for a moment, it simply stayed there, engine running, neither advancing nor retreating. She looked at the building from inside the vehicle. The gates were closed. The wing behind them showed no movement, no light, no sign of the administrative energy that had been planned for it across months of architectural consultation and contract negotiation. She did not speak. She did not get out of the car. She did not gesture toward the gate or reach for her phone or do any of the things a person does when they believe the situation in front of them is still negotiable. She merely observed through glass, from a distance that was not quite far enough to be comfortable, the space she had been planning to transform into the centerpiece of her institutional legacy. And then the car moved on. She did not need anyone to explain what the locked gate meant. She understood it with a completeness that required no translation. The gate was closed. The credentials were revoked. The legal mechanism had activated, and the document had been served, and the archive had been deployed, and the deadline had been set. There was nothing in front of her that she could claim, reverse, or negotiate back into a different shape. She could only observe what she could not reach. And the observation itself, silent, complete, conducted through glass from a moving car, was its own kind of answer to every question she had arrived at Sandringham intending to resolve. The real question was never whether Camilla had the legal right to modernize the West Wing. It was always whether the belonging she believed the crown had conferred upon her was ever actually unconditional, whether the access, the authority, the institutional permanence she had waited decades to occupy was ever fully and irrevocably hers, or whether it had always existed inside a legal framework that someone else held the keys to, whether what she had been granted was ownership, or whether it was always only permission. And whether that distinction, now that it has been named in a legal filing and enforced at a gate and embedded in a deadline timed to the centenary of a dead queen's birth, can ever be unnamed again. History does not usually announce itself with a press release. It announces itself in the gap between a biometric scan being rejected and a car moving slowly past a locked gate, in a dispatch box that is no longer in its vault, in a guest list revised twice in a single week for a gathering that was supposed to be simple, in an archivist brought in quietly, without explanation, to a building whose most private rooms are currently frozen inside a legal injunction that nobody in the palace will publicly acknowledge, in the specific silence of an institution that has survived abdications and wars and constitutional crises and the loss of its longest-serving sovereign, and that is now watching something move through its corridors that it does not yet have the language to describe. What comes next will not be announced. It will simply appear in a legal filing, or a security log, or a name that is absent from a gathering, the palace will describe as intimate and private and entirely in keeping with the family's wishes. And by the time anyone thinks to ask why that name is missing, and what its absence means, and whether the door that closed behind it was closed from the inside or the outside,